Right before we jump into this video, if you'd like me to send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations, just look for this orange box over on froknosphoto.com, put your name, email address in it, hit send it. I'm going to send you that guide for free. Jared Polin, froknosphoto.com, and this is a comparison between the Sony A9 III and the Sony A1 II. The idea behind this video is to help you decide which one you should go with if you're looking to pick one of these bad boys up. Now, some people might want to go with an A9 III, and you'll find out why, or others might just want to go with an A1 II. Now, before we get too far, just know I have hands-on experience with both of these cameras, and there's links down below to videos that we've already posted with these, so you can find more information about each one of these cameras separately. But now, let's jump into this comparison to help you decide which one might be the right one for you. So the first thing we're going to start with are the image sensors inside of these cameras. Now, keep in mind, Sony considers the A1 II their flagship, their top of the line, and the A9 III, when it came out, well, this is just super unique because of the type of sensor that this has inside of the camera. It's the first one in a type of camera like this to offer that. So let's look at the A1 II. It has a 50.1 megapixel full frame BSI stacked CMOS sensor that's powered by dual Bions XR processors. Now, the A1 II prioritizes quality over speed, whereas the A9 III, well, that one's going to be speed over quality. Now let's look at the sensor here. It's a 24.6 megapixel full frame BSI stacked CMOS sensor with a global shutter. Yes, a global shutter. It's the first camera of any company in this style of camera to put out a global shutter sensor. Real fast, here's what a global sensor shutter does. It fires all the pixels at once and boom, captures the image. No banding, no warping, no flickering of screens, because it just captures everything in one fell swoop. Whereas one of the older sensors, like you find in most mirrorless cameras and DSLRs back in the day, they are scanning sensors, meaning when you take the picture, it's scanning from top to bottom and reading it out. So it reads a line, reads a line, reads a line, and boom. That's why you end up with some lines and some flickering in some of the photos that you get. Now, some sensors are faster readout speeds than other. This is a stacked sensor, so it is one of the fastest reading sensors on the market, but it is not a global shutter. The A9 III has the global shutter sensor in it. It also is powered by dual Bions XR processors, and this one favors speed over quality, but it does take a slight hit when you get to dynamic range. The big question here: do you want 50 megapixels? Do you want 24 megapixels? Do you care about cropping? Do you not care about cropping? Honestly, you can still crop 24 megapixels and get great results for most of the way that people present their images in this day and age. And even if you print them and you crop it, it's still going to look fine in 24 megapixels. You have to ask yourself, is 50 better than 24? Do you want speed? But even with saying speed, yeah, you still get a great amount of speed with this camera, as we'll see when we progress forward. I know I'm trying to jump forward here, but who gets the check mark here? Check marks I give to the camera that I favor at that particular thing, and in this case, they both get a check mark because they both are super unique. This thing, 50 megapixels, amazing. This thing, global shutter sensor, amazing. They both get a check mark. Let's move into ISO, starting with the A1 II. Its native ISO range is 100 to 32,000, expandable to 102,400. The Sony A9 III natively is 250 to 25,600, expandable up to 51,200. It's basically a stop and a third worse when it comes to native base ISO. I haven't seen a camera do 250 ISO. I mean, we used to see 200 way back in the Nikon days. 200 was the base ISO, and then 100, and Nikon goes all the way down to 64 with some of their cameras. That is one of the trade-offs. 250 ISO is a stop and a third different than 100. Usually, lower ISOs tend to be better in certain situations. That is a big deal. Higher ISO capability in this camera is not as good as you would find in a regular sensor like the old technology that they had, but everything is a trade-off. So I've used this. It's very good. I've gotten around the limitations because the camera can make up for that, but just know there is a slight dynamic range hit. Now, when you go over to the 50 megapixel camera, when you go to higher ISOs, you tend to start to see more noise because you're double the amount of pixels as the 24 megapixel version. You're at 50 megapixels here. This is giving you very nice dynamic range. It's kind of a wash. You can push this a little further because of the technology that it uses, and this maybe not as far, but you really don't need to be going more than 25,600 in most situations these days. Again, this is going to be a recurring theme that you need to ask yourself. 50 megapixels versus 24. Do you want the sensor readout speed that's not going to get any banding and warping, or is that not a big deal to you? These are all very tough questions that you're going to need to answer yourself, or you just buy both of them and use them in different situations. But let's move on here. Let's move on to frame rate. The A12 can do 10 frames per second with a mechanical shutter in 14-bit uncompressed RAW, 30 frames per second electronic shutter in compressed RAW, 20 frames per second electronic in 14-bit uncompressed RAW, and it has oversampled crop modes for extra reach and better detail. So you can bang in there, go down to 21 megapixels when you go into the crop mode, and that way you can get more bang for your buck. Honestly, you can just crop after the fact, but this one tops out at 30 frames per second, which is still insane. It used to be really insane until the A9 III came out, because the A9 III can do 120 frames per second with the electronic shutter in 14-bit uncompressed RAW with other selectable frame rates like 30 and 60 in the camera. 120 frames per second RAW. Lightning. What do you need to shoot that fast? There's not a lot of stuff that you need to shoot that fast, but if you're trying to capture something that's happening fast and you don't want to miss it, you have the ability to set this camera to shoot at 30, 60, and 120 frames per second. I have a little bit of a problem there. This one maxes out at 30. The reason I have a problem is they both shoot at 30. I would like to be able to dial this camera in to 40. To 50 frames per second. Hopefully with a firmware upgrade or a firmware update, they will allow us to do that, but that would differentiate these a little bit more. Because if you want more than 30 frames a second, you gotta dial it to 60, and you gotta go from there. Other than that, 30 frames a second is still blazing fast, especially at 50 megapixels. Who's gonna get the check mark? I'm going with the A9 III for a check mark here because 120 frames per second raw uncompressed is insane. Let me jump in here real quick because I want to show you our custom Lightroom presets in action on this cute dog right here, starting with Blue's Clues, followed by Brooklyn. We've got C41, Copper Tone, which looks awesome, DeLorean, High C, Kaleidoscope, Mel Brooks, Saltwater Taffy, Thick, Tintype, and Wet Hot American Summer. And my all-time favorite from FroPack 1, with one click, we've got Skittles, and it goes boom. But all new and exclusive to FroPack 4, we have 4 custom adaptive Lightroom presets called Face Enhance, Full Body Skin Enhance, Eye Only Enhance, and Background Blur. So look, if you want to speed up your raw workflow, give yourself a great starting point, or you're just tired of other people's presets sucking, as you can see, our presets do not suck. That's why we created 14 all-new custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at froknowsphoto.com/FroPack4. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters, and if you decide to pick them up right now, they are currently on sale. Or if you want to get the Grand Slam bundle that includes FroPack 1, 2, 3, and 4, and of course my favorite Skittles, you can save even more. Now, let's get back to the video. One other differentiator between these two cameras is you have a mechanical shutter in the A12. You do not have a mechanical shutter in the A9 III at all. But with the global shutter sensor that you have, it's not that big of a deal. The only time it comes into play is some people like the fact that you can lower the shutter when the camera turns off to technically protect the sensor, but if you ruin the shutter, you kind of ruin your camera as well. Not that big of a deal, but just something that differentiates these two bodies. Let's jump on to the autofocus. When the A9 III came out, it blew the A1 out of the water, the original A1 in terms of autofocus. The A1 II comes out and it has the same exact processor that you find in the A9 III. So you're gonna end up with basically the same quality autofocus throughout. The only difference was Sony added with the A1 II the auto switching mode that's going to auto select between humans or animals when it's doing detection, where that isn't in the A9 III. That's not a deal breaker. You can still select what you want to shoot, but they have the same exact autofocus and it's exquisite across the board. So none of them are getting a check mark here. Moving on to burst rate. The A1 II can do 240 RAW files when shooting in compressed RAW or 84 in uncompressed RAW before you fill the buffer. The A9 III can do 192 RAW files when shooting in uncompressed RAW. That's like 1.6 seconds of shooting if you're shooting at 120 frames per second. Remember that the A1 II does 30 frames per second, and the A9 III can do all the way up to 120 frames per second. So your buffers are going to vary there because one of them you're shooting so much faster in. And of course, one of them is twice the file size because it's 50 megapixels versus 24. One of the most important features for a lot of action shooters who don't want to miss something is called pre-capture. Both of these cameras offer pre-capture. And honestly, before the A1 II came out, the A9 III was the one that offered pre-capture that was like, hey, if you have an A1, maybe you should look at this because we don't know when an A1 II is coming, and pre-capture for action is so worth it. So there's this tiny little difference here, is the A9 III can do anywhere from 1 second of pre-capture all the way down to 1/100th of a second of pre-capture. So at a full second, if you're shooting at 120 frames per second, you're getting 120 frames per second pre-captured before you shoot an actual picture. What it's doing is saving it in the buffer. It's in the buffer. It's not doing anything while your finger's pressed halfway down and you're continuously focusing. It's buffering and buffering and buffering. When you press it, you get those 120 saved, and then you continue to shoot. But if you're pre-shooting at 120 frames per second, you're not going to get that many shots after the fact because the buffer is going to be filled. And on the A1 II side, you have your 1 full second, just like the A9 III, all the way down to 3/100ths of a second. I don't know how many shots that's actually going to give you. If I was doing it, I'd be at like 0.3, 0.4, maybe a half a second, because I'm used to shooting at a half a second. But you do chew up extra files every time you take a picture, but it allows you to reach into the past and grab something that you otherwise would have missed, because sometimes you're just a little late, but with pre-capture, you're getting those shots that you would have missed. Both of these cameras have a speed boost button right on the front of it. Now, speed boost with the A1 II is kind of questionable because it only shoots at 30 frames per second. So if you're shooting at 30 frames per second and you hit the speed boost button, you're not going to get more than 30 frames per second. Now, where that might come in handy is if you want to shoot uncompressed RAW at 20 frames per second, and then for some reason something fast is going to happen and you press that speed boost button, well, you can activate 30 frames per second, which automatically takes it back into the compressed RAW. Now, on the A9 III side, you could shoot in 30 or 60 frames per second, and then with one click of a button, it can jump into and speed boost to 120 frames per second. So speed boost is really speed boost with the A9 III, which means we're giving it 120 check marks. For those of you who care about the video features and specs of these cameras, let's jump into the A1 II. It has the same resolution and frame rate as the original A1. Full frame 8K UHD video recording up to 30 frames per second, oversampled from 8.6K, or a 10% crop in 4K up to 120 frames per second in 10-bit 422 with line skipping. If you don't want line skipping, you can shoot in Super 35 4K oversampled from 5.8K with no pixel binning up to 60 frames per second. You have full HD up to 240 frames per second. You have AI-based features like auto framing and framing stabilizer. IBIS with up to 8.5 stops of stabilization is also included here, which is an upgrade from the original Sony A1. Now onto the A9 III, you have full frame 4K UHD video recording up to 60 frames per second oversampled from 6K, or full frame 4K up to 120 frames per second in 10-bit 422 with line skipping. full HD up to 120 frames per second. It is distortion free with 0 rolling shutter due to its global shutter, as we talked about earlier. You've got your AI-based features like auto framing and framing stabilizer, and IBIS up to 8 stops of stabilization, not 8.5. That global shutter sensor, wow. If you are on a train, a bullet train, imagine that. You're on a bullet train and you're shooting with a regular sensor, you are gonna get flat out jelloing. Every line is gonna be bowed. With this camera, not happening with the A9 III because it is reading every single pixel every time you're capturing video. It is truly insane. Now, these aren't really meant to be your first go-to video cameras, but they are hybrid, they do great stills, they can do great competent video. Of course, it comes down to what are you doing? Do you know what you're doing? But in this case, the A9 III is getting the check mark because you are going to get slightly better video. Let me cut in here real quick and let you know this video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you're looking to build your very own online portfolio, use what I've used for my personal website at jaredpolin.com for close to 15 years now because it's simple, easy, affordable, and I don't need to know coding. And in fact, I can make money on the website because I can put up a Squarespace store in a matter of minutes and start selling stuff. So if you want to get a 14-day free trial, head on over to squarespace.com/FronosPhoto. If you decide that it's for you, use the code FronosPhoto at checkout to get 10% off your first order. Now, let's get back to the video. In terms of the electronic viewfinder, you have the same exact viewfinder. The only differences you will find inside of the box is that the A1 II is coming with a new eye cup that is much softer, kind of like a pillow when you rest it against your face. You can take that off and put it onto the other A9 III because they share the same body, but in this case, that's the only difference. Check mark for getting the new eye cup for the A1 II. This is an important feature to talk about. It's your max shutter speed that you can get. The A1 II will max out at 1/32,000th of a second. That's still really fast. Think about it. If you're shooting with 50 1.2 lenses, anything that's wide open, 1.4s, and you're in a bright situation where normally you would have to put an ND filter or a variable ND filter on your camera, you can shoot at much faster shutter speeds, which allows you to shoot wide open, get that beautiful depth of field, and still have the ability to not have to use a filter. That's incredible. On the A9 III side, you can shoot all the way up to 1/80,000th of a second. Yes, 1/80,000th of a second, and also with flash sync, you can do that at all shutter speeds. That is incredible for people who shoot flash. The fact that you can sync at any speed is insane. Now there's one slight caveat. If you're shooting at 120 frames per second, the max shutter speed you can get is 1/16,000th of a second. You're coming up to limitations of how fast your shutter speed needs to go to give you 120 frames per second. So if you dialed that down to 60, you can be back up at that 1/80,000th of a second shutter speed. With the A9 III, you're getting flicker-free shooting because you're shooting with a global shutter sensor. Now that's not to say that the A1 II isn't capable of doing something similar. You can go into the anti-flicker mode where you can dial in a shutter speed to the flicker of the light. It will read it and then it will get around that flicker. It's just a little more complicated to do that, whereas with the A9 III, you never have to worry about it because you are reading the sensor all at once. Meaning it's either going to be all black frame or it's going to be perfect. So it's the flick or the it's whichever one you're gonna get. But it's never in between, like when you shot with the DSLRs in a gymnasium and half the image would have this color and half would have the other because you caught the flick and the at different times. Moving on, same screens on the back of these cameras, same card slots, in essence, the same exact body, the same feel with a few minor differences. You have a faster Ethernet port, LAN port on this A1 II than you do have on the A9 III, which is kind of interesting that they did that, but is that gonna make that big of a difference? The answer to that is really no, because your file sizes are twice as big with this camera as they are with this, so it probably is a washout whichever way you go. But neither of these can get a check mark for being the better body because they are both great bodies. Another subtle difference is that you have pixel shift shooting here with the A1 II. You don't have pixel shift shooting here. I've never shot pixel shift personally. It's more of like if you're a landscape shooter and you want to get more, you can totally do that. And one of the accessories that comes in the box with the A1 II is different than the A9 III, and that is the battery charger. You get a dual battery charger with the A1 II. You can also purchase that separately if you have any other Sony camera. I highly recommend you do that because they work with the smaller batteries. But the chargers are basically the same exact size, but you get two on one, the other one you just get one, and there's no other power brick. It just plugs into USB-C and starts charging your batteries. And finally, let's talk about the price. The A1 II comes in at $6,498, with the original A1 dropping to $5,500 for anybody who wants to keep that in mind. We have videos about that down below as well. And the A9 III comes in at $5,998, so $6,000. We got a $500 difference between these two cameras. At the end of the day, which one do you go with? This is such a tough decision to make. One, I like having speed for the stuff that I'm shooting. Do I care about 50 megapixels over 24? And the answer to that for me is no, but for you, it may be yes, I want more megapixels. You get 30 frames per second over here at 50 megapixels is insane. But if you're an action shooter and you shoot in places where there's a lot of flickering lights, you can't go wrong with this. You have to ask yourself the question, high megapixels, not high megapixels, fast speed, global shutter sensor. Am I good at shooting 250 ISO, getting a hit on that dynamic range? I don't think anybody will ever notice the difference in the real world when you're posting your images, but this is a coin toss. You have to ask yourself all those questions. This isn't easy. And once again, down below in the description, we've got links to videos with both of these cameras in action in the real world to help you decide which one might be the right one for you. But checkmark-wise, they both get check marks. They are both fantastic, incredible cameras, and it really comes down to personal preference for deciding which one is the right one for you. So if you got this far, which one of these cameras would you go with and why? Let me know down below. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up. Maybe it helps us get more reach. I don't know. But I thank you guys for watching. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.